Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Inga Hansen, and I will be your host for today's Medtech Intelligence virtual event, Bridging the Gap, Agile Compliance. We'd like to thank Matrix Requirements for sponsoring this program so we can bring it to you at no cost. And a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You are listening in today using GoTo's web-based broadcast system. This system uses your computer speaker system by default, so there is no call-in number. If you're having difficulty with the audio, please either log out and log back in or increase your computer's volume. If you continue to have sound issues, you can contact Veronica Allen via the chat box to let her know that your audio is not working properly. Today's event will include a 45-minute presentation followed by a Q&A. You can submit your text questions at any time during the presentation by using the question or chat panel in your GoToWebinar control panel. And at the end of the presentation, we will address these. You're also going to be able to participate in some interactive polls that will appear on your screen throughout the presentation, and we do encourage you to participate in those. You can download a PDF of the slides in the handouts pane of your control panel. If you're using a mobile device, this will appear as a page icon. And please make sure to download the files during the webinar because these will not be emailed to you following the event. And I'm excited now to introduce our presenters. Today we will be hearing from Anne Kelsvin, who is the RAQA manager at Matrix Requirements. And Anne will be joined by Buthena Shavawi, who is a sales executive and entrepreneur, as well as Rob Hyatt, who is a consultant and customer success manager. And Anne, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And Anne will be coming on in just a moment. Oh, Anne, are you here? Anne, are you able to come on camera? And I'm sorry, we will check in with Anne. Let's start in just a moment. Hi, Anne. Are you here on camera?
I think I can see Anne's sound on. And if you can hear me, would you try to get off, log out and log back in to see if we can hear you again, please? Thank you for bearing with us, everybody. We're trying to get our speaker back. Please give us a couple of seconds, okay? We're trying to get her back online. Thank you. We're sorry for the technical difficulties.
Thank you all again for your patience. Ann is coming back in, and we apologize again for the technical difficulty. And just a reminder, while we have a moment here, do remember to download the handouts, and that way you will have those because we won't be sending them out. You will receive a link with the on-demand portion to review this or share this event afterward. And again, thank you for your patience, and we will be coming right back with our presenters. Hi, everyone, and we apologize. It looks like Ann is having technical difficulties, so we do want to welcome Rob Hyatt. He is going to come in and get us started. And so, Rob, are you here, Rob? We're excited to have you join us.
Oh,
Hello.
sorry about that. Yeah, you had me muted.
Oh,
Yeah, so hey everybody, I'm going to try to do some justice to Ann's presentation here. Let me just get to the slide deck. And I don't have control. There we go. So Ann is our PhD in bioengineering and RAQA manager of medical at Matrix Requirements here. And like we said, technical problems prevent her from communicating, but we're going to try to cover her slides. And then Botania will go through kind of an agile workflow. She's our sales executive at Matrix Requirements. And then I'm a consultant for Matrix. I've been using their tool for about 6 years in my own practice, embedded system design, electrical engineering, computer science. And I've become a bit of a evangelist, I guess, on the capability of the tools. My work is largely in design control, documentation, regulatory submissions, and Matrix just really has accelerated that work. So we're going to go through some of that. And I think Ann's main gist is that we have a dichotomy between RA and QA and developers, and you know, different mindsets, different needs, and that's sort of our goal is to bridge that gap and to find a common methodology where we're all on the same page and we're generating products that help the world. So we had a short poll here, and hopefully you guys can answer that. I'm just trying to get a genetic makeup of who's on our webinar here. Are you RAQA only, software developer, C-suite, other? Just to try to get us a feel. I think this webinar is mostly for, you know, RAQA and software development, the coexistence, and the mutual, you know, work that's necessary between the two. And of course, C-levels help guide us, and so curious on who's there. So, wow, a lot of RAQA folks. Not so many developers, surprised about that. And other, don't know what other roles would be, maybe engineering, DevOps, that sort of stuff. But anyway, that's great. Let's get back to the slide deck here. So fundamentally, our focus at Matrix Requirements is moving into the SXMD world, we're calling it, software as a medical device or software in a medical device. And most medical device manufacturers have been around for a long time, but the software aspect is what's new and what we're trying to help bridge the gap. A lot of software developers grew out of consumer world or health IT type world, Apple apps, and as you cross the line into regulation, regulated software with certification requirements and legal requirements, that's where we're trying to bridge that gap, if you will, so that we coexist in the same world. It's fundamentally two different job descriptions, but one world that we need to coexist in. So we're trying to get another poll here about what standards are you using in your development product. Here's a full list, risk management, software standards 62304 or health IT standards, usability standards, 60601-1, a lot of numbers here, but hopefully as you've gone from a consumer type company into the regulated, these numbers make sense to you. So trying to get a little answer here from the poll. I'm curious, hopefully 62304 is on top, which right behind risk management, which makes sense. 82304 has 0, it's a little surprising, and 62366 has 0 is a little surprising as well. The usability standards are quite required, usability type testing, formative and summative. So I'm a little surprised that that's 0, but the 62304, good. So hopefully most of you are familiar with that. And let's get back to the slide deck. Where's the button? Okay. So fundamentally, software in and or as a medical device. We all know now that software can be a medical device in and of itself. That's what's changed over the last 10 years. The standalone mobile apps, software in a medical device, embedded systems have been around a long time, but this standalone aspect is what's new, and still risk-based, necessary, to risk quantify your device and document software appropriately for that, and all the QMS processes and technical documentation are still required. So that's nothing's changed there as you work in software only. The 82304 is around standalone software. I think I'll skip through that, but fundamentally ISO certification for the processes and the risk management we talked about. So those are some of the sort of things. And these regulations are pretty prescriptive in terms of what you need to do. The planning aspect, the risk assessment, implementing the lifecycle management from product envisioning to product sunset, with the documentation being sort of centrally required from a regulatory perspective. 62304, we're going to go through this as it relates to the documentation that's required. So that's just an intro slide. And we're going to move to Botania, where she can talk about, how we can do this in still an agile methodology, and get us to where we need to be.
Yeah, so hi everyone, thank you, Rob. Agile has been a word that was around for quite a while now. As you probably know, it was created in 2001 when 17 developers gathered in Utah in a resort to try to discuss lightweight development methods, and together they published the Agile Manifesto, which are like 12 key concepts. 12 key concepts, but here are the most important ones. So first of all is iterative development, which means we are going to start building our project little piece, item by item and not everything at once, and then we test everything. We're going to iterate through our process, develop this part, test it, make sure it's okay, that it's approved, and then we're going to move on to the next part. This way, we're going to get a lot of advantages. First of all, we're going to have the continuous feedback, because maybe we're going to start developing and halfway we're going to realize it's not exactly what we wanted to do, or that we can do better. So it's easier to do modification when we're within the process of development rather than at the end. So of course it implies flexibility and collaboration within the developer teams, but also with like the business team, as we say in software, which means the management team, and the QA people, like other people from different teams and who have different logic and continuous delivery, which means we are ensured to always have something new coming. It is also extremely important because that way we have better control of what we're doing. There is, since 2003, this team called DORA that now belongs to Google Cloud, that is under Google Cloud, who proved something. Every year they publish this study and they prove that a good software is depending on two things. First of all, the speed. So we have this continuous delivery and the stability. Not only we go fast, but we do well. We do not have anymore to choose either speed or stability. We can do both. Also, we can measure that really easily through some KPIs, and depending on the product we're trying to develop. Of course, here we're in the medical device, so we can set certain standards for our KPIs to track our development and our efficiency. For instance, we decide, okay, we should track what we're doing, how often we deploy something, which is, for instance, our deployment frequency. And how do we know what we're doing is the right thing to do? How do we know if we're good or bad? So the DORA team came up with these four big categories, where you can be either elite, high, medium, or low. And depending, so you have these goals to reach if you want to be an elite. And this is typically where we want to be as medical device developers. And especially that we can see in the study that more and more companies are within this range of either elite or high. The idea here is really to emphasize that, yes, indeed, it is important for developers to know how they're working and to make them work better, because it's more convenient, it's easier on them. However, it has impact on other development, and we can extend this logic and this approach to the QA world. For instance, regulation changes. How can we adapt quickly and if with the less effort to this new change? By being agile, we can know exactly what was modified and go for it and adapt quickly. We improve communication. Often we have this feeling that there's two islands, one with the R&D people, the other one with the QA, and it's really hard to make them match their logic. So being agile allows to have this kind of bond between the two teams. We are always here on the continuous improvement. We always try to do better and blame less post-mortem. But how do we work in Agile? When we work in Agile, we said that we are going item-based. This is what you can see on the left column of the screen. So you're going to divide your development process by different stages, which we call sprint. So this is a Scrum methodology within the Agile family. This is the most common one. And during your sprint, you're going to develop, test, report, and once everything is okay and validated, you're going to move to the next sprint and to the next sprint until you're done with your development process.
So I wanted to dive in here. As Botania mentioned, the birth of the Agile work 20 some odd years ago in Utah, it's where I live, by the way. Out of that came an Agile manifesto, and I wanted to repeat it here because it's sort of key to my next set of slides, there was 4 key values: the individuals and interactions over processes and tools, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan, and my favorite is working software over comprehensive documentation. I've been working with Agile teams a long time, and that last one was sort of, I generally sum it up as an excuse for developers to go, oh, hey, we don't need to do documentation. Working software is more important than a comprehensive documentation. And the key word is over, and that does not mean instead of. It means, focus on this, but still do that. And the working documentation, the working software is obviously most important, but from a regulatory perspective, the rules are the rules, and comprehensive documentation is just required. The responding to a change over following a plan, well, one of the documentation, that needs to be produced is still various aspects of plans. So, no complete get out of jail free when we talk about regulated software. See the slide deck, there's the button. So 62304 is really the framework for most of the documentation required. Hopefully this diagram is, it's a little fuzzy, but hopefully you guys all know it. The top part is the system actions, the user requirements and the custom needs, and that's actually out of scope for the standard. The lower part is, the process bubbles that flow into each other, that if you looked at this, you could envision a very waterfall flow. And that's not necessary in this Agile transformation of this. But basically every bubble here is a set of documentation that needs to be done. There's, by phase, there's software development planning, requirements, architecture, detailed design, system testing, integration testing, release, software risk management, configuration control, problem resolution. And while that slide that Latanya shows, in the iterative nature, you're incrementally building the system, the process model that aligns 62304 to the Agile flow is, well, just create a little bit of documentation in each of these bubbles here throughout the iteration. And that definition of done should include both the working code and the documentation that is necessary for the regulatory output. So this diagram is quite important to this whole function. So we'd kind of like to get a little information on, in your teams, who's creating that documentation? Is the, QARA responsible for it on their own? Is development doing it? Is it a shared function? Are you leveraging automated documentation tools? I know companies that are developing design documentation directly from parsing the code, including all the function headers and function descriptions and sequence diagrams within the code, call charts, database diagrams, all that sort of detailed function. Wow, so developers are chiming in here and doing a lot of the development work for the documentation. That's great. Sure, some of you will say, I wish we didn't have to do that, but good that you are. So next slide. 62304 is not the only documentation necessary. Depending on your regulatory classification and pathway, there's going to be requirements from the EU. MDCG is a class 2A, different than a class 3. There's going to be more rigid documentation to higher the risk strata. We talked about 62366, that was 0% in the poll. Usability testing on these apps is required. So what sort of usability testing do you need to do? That's going to dictate probably 1 to 5 types of usability documentation, from informal formative plans and results to much more formal blinded summative type usability tests that are much more rigorous and needing specific sample size of the people that are in the usability study. If you're an app developer and you're just providing this product to somebody else, there's going to be different documentation requirements on you. But if you're the legal manufacturer and you have the CE mark or the FDA 510(k) submission approval, that's going to dictate different level of documentation you're going to need. Do you have clinical claims to your software? If so, ISO 14155 is going to have a lot of clinical evidence, clinical evaluation, potentially clinical trial, patient consent forms, lots more different documentation on clinical claims versus a health app or a wellness app that still has benefit to a patient, but you're not claiming, clinical significance. And whether your app supports in vitro diagnostic functions, there would be other documentation requirements. So lots of documentation. This next couple slides is designed to just give you an overview, organized by phases that are defined by 1345 and implied within 62/304, and the FDA references in column A. But fundamentally, this type of matrix would be defined as part of your project start to say, hey, for this product, for this safety classification of this device and this regulatory pathway, and answering those questions that I mentioned, you would pop out a matrix in terms of the documents that you need to create. Document numbering is to keep them organized amongst yourselves. Ideally, you would pre-plan a RACI type matrix on who's writing the document and who's going to approve it. And this sort of roadmap in the beginning of your project, usually either embedded in your SOPs themselves or as an appendix in the overall software development quality plan, would pretty much, drive the documentation that's going to be required, whether there's clinical evaluation needs, the verification, the validation, your design input processes, risk analysis, user needs, hazard analysis, all those, various functions would be, spread across several phases, the design and development or the design input, leading to the design output. This is where we're going to tie into cybersecurity, instructions for use, software FMEA, usability, the requirement to actually have design review meetings at various phase gates would be, a documented requirement. And back to that agile flow, these documents are growing over time. And when you get to the release phase, the architecture design may be a 200-page document, but back to that iterative flow where you've just, done a startup sprint and maybe 2 or 3 sprints on 10% of your features. The idea is embedding that documentation deliverable as part of the iterative lifecycle. Your software architecture design spec would go from, 10 pages at sprint 2 to 15 at sprint 3, and 100 pages by the product release. Likewise, dynamically building up your testing protocols along the way. Some things you're not going to be able to do till the end, like an overall security penetration type tests. Your trace matrices won't be complete, of course, until you have your full product requirements and full user requirements. But bottom line is this set of documentation would provide the roadmap for those things you're going to do, including at the end, an overall design history file index, which is the regulatory audit ready index, if you will, of all your documentation. You've kept track of change requests after a point in time in the sprint or in the release cycle where you sort of hit the minimum viable product and have a base set of requirements that you're delivering. You want to start managing change via formal change request. And then we talked about the necessary clinical trial after clinical trial monitoring after the release of the product, continuous feedback in terms of how it's used in the field, those sorts of functions. So each of these documents, it seems overwhelming if you looked at that list of 40 to 80 documents, but they're all bound in regulations. And each of these documents has a plan. It has a prescribed purpose, if you will. If you want to reach out after this webinar, we have a succinct description of all these documents, why they're needed, and more importantly, what the business value is of these. A lot of these documentation needs are not just regulatory documents. They're business continuity. They're going to provide the ability to scale up a new team or a different team, or to take over a maintenance from a different team, and they have a roadmap on how the system works, and that's business value. I remember one customer I had that says, the documentation's all in the code. We don't need to do this. And I still joke about that, because there was some good documentation in the code, but there was also a million lines of code and no hierarchical way to figure out what this thing even did. So again, each of these documents has a purpose, has a reasonable need, and just a secondary slide on why the planning document is important. It's going to provide the roadmap and provide the collaboration toolkit between the various groups in the company. Back to that RACI, clear ownership on who's writing the document, who needs to approve it, who needs to contribute it, who needs to just be informed by that document. And that planning really makes this agile process work. So one final poll, I think, just generally, what's the status of your documentation? Is it in Confluence? Is it in Wiki? Is it in the code? Or do you have a full design control set of documents that you've submitted to a regulatory body, for instance? Just trying to get a little information here on where you guys are at. Okay. And I think that's going to lead us. Okay, so 50% is at least submitted something. The 33% of nothing. Hopefully you have a plan to either be a non-regulated app, and or figure out how you're going to shore up your documentation for regulatory approvals. So let's get into the next set with Botania.
So another really important topic that we would see emerging even more and more in the coming year about medical device would be AI. However, as much as trendy as it is and as great as it could be, what is a good AI? How do we know our AI is relevant? So first of all, what is AI? AI is a field where we're going to process data to analyze it and learn from it in order to help with decision making. Under AI, you have two main subcategories. You have first machine learning, where you want to go and try to find relationship with your data. And then you have deep learning. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning where you need a vast amount of data. You're going to use neural network to learn from this massive data set, and you want to kind of mimic the brain in the decision-making process. But in order to do AI, we should go back to the very first basis of it. We need data, but what is it? It's a factual information. So it could be a measurement, a criteria, a statistic, some sort of description used as a basis for reasoning, discussion, or calculation. This is like a dictionary definition, but we do have two types of data. Either we know what is our data, it's labeled. For instance, here in the upper part, we have photos of Apple, and we know because we have the name in the column. Yeah, okay, this is an apple, this is not something else. So now we can decide to have a model where we can upload all sorts of images. It can be other fruits, it can be like all kind of items. And what we want to do is just to be able to recognize what is an apple or not. So this is the supervised learning, the very intuitive one. However, what happens when we have this massive input of data with a lot of dimension, but we don't know what to do? Should we just throw it away? Is there any way to make it make sense? We can do it throughout like unsupervised learning, where we're trying to find clusters and neighbors in order to reclassify our data before moving forward. And within these two big families, we have a million of applications for all industries, but even in healthcare, we have so many implications. For example, we said with supervised learning, we can do our classification. We submit an image, we know what is an apple, what is not an apple. So if we take this idea and we translate it into the medical device, it's going to be, for example, cancer prediction. We're going to upload all sorts of CT scans, for instance, and we want to know which one has cancer or not, or which one has like a broken bone or not. For unsupervised learning, we can do try to find structure. So we can imagine we're going to import this vast data about patients with all sorts of information, something really, really huge. And we're going to try to find some common points or some kind of structures through it. So the use of it is endless in healthcare. However, we shouldn't forget that in order to get to these extremely amazing results, we need a good data and we need people to understand what they're trying to do and what they're trying to reach. Even ChatGPT, like I asked him, how do you make a good AI? And he insists on the point of being a good data scientist. It doesn't really matter if we have an amazing cloud or strong code if we're not in the first place understanding where we're going and which direction we're going to take. So what does that mean? First of all, as we said, we must check the quality of our data. We must understand what it is meaning, if it's relevant, what happens if we have a missing value, something incorrect, or if it's just showing a part of the truth but occulting a big part. So this field is called data mining, and this is so important to do as we begin. And then we can start with building a simple algorithm and testing as we go to make sure we're heading into the right direction. This is why it's important to have a clear structure in our mind. Then we can challenge the model to see like if it's performant enough, if it's reliable enough, how can we optimize it, can we make it lighter, quicker, this kind of thing. And then we go and we test on data subset, because the idea here is not to test on a massive volume of data for the test, because it's going to take so long. And what happens if we notice something wrong, then we're going to lose a lot of time. So we can go and test on small subset every time as we go. It's the most efficient way to proceed. So as a sum up, the first thing is to understand the product requirement, then to understand the data that we want to work with. Then in our mind, we're going to do two operations. First of all, understand the data we're working with, if the quality of it is good, if it's reliable, the bias of the data. For example, it was in California a few years ago, they decided to get rid of humans bias during trial for the jury. So they decided to use an AI to do that. However, they bumped into a big problem, because when they started using it, they saw like people from minorities got harder sentences or more severe sentences rather than people from non-minorities. And when they tried to understand why was that, it's because on their data set, it had the bias of the people who built it. So this is why it's important to try to understand the data. On the other hand, at the same time, we must understand the model and its complexity, its size. We don't want something extremely performant but super slow to get relevance. All of this should be taken into consideration as we go. We check one, we check the other, and we build our program like that till the end where we get our modeling.
So we wanted to leave you with some key takeaways here. I need to move the next slide, please. Control the deck. Okay, there it is. Sorry. So a couple key takeaways. This regulatory compliance and development go hand in hand. That's the point of this conversation. I was really happy with the poll that 50% of the documentation was being done by the developers, while the regulatory did an aspect of it. The regulatory requirements themselves provide the framework. You don't need to come up with your own thing. Just follow the regulations, follow the templates that are available for each of these types of documentation. Like I said, if you want a detailed purpose of each of these documents and how they should be structured, reach out to us. But there's no need to redevelop the wheel. And just keep in mind, that the business value there is as well. This is not just working code over documentation. It's documentation to supplement the working code, meet business needs, meet regulatory needs, meet the health of the consumer who's using your apps. I went pretty fast through a bunch of types of documents, and I indicated there's questions to ask to figure out which of these documents you need. That's a difficult thing. I mean, I've been in this business a really long time, done quite a few submissions, but the regulatory pathway is so dynamic. What is changing? The Cures Act and the MDDS ruling and these new regulations, guidances come out every 3 months from the FDA on deprioritizing the regulatory pathway for this. It's a health app, it's this or that. Stay engaged with regulatory experts that can help guide you through. Take advantage of an FDA Q-Sub, get their input on, where does this app fit? The problem is, in the Agile world, be agile in terms of switching that regulatory pathway, because typically what happens is the code is easy and you have a feature and then you've crossed the line because you've got, well, we can run a rule on that feature and make a recommendation to the patient. It seems easy to do in code, but your whole regulatory pathway changed. So that initial planning and the continued analysis of the planning documents throughout the life cycle to make sure, as you are iteratively, agilely working through an application to be delivered, that you haven't crossed those lines that require you to reverse engineer all this documentation at the end, which is just painful for all parties. Efficient software development, including this documentation, really does drive the success of the business. And I urge you to look at tools out there that help accelerate that documentation deliverable. Matrix requirements is one of them. Application lifecycle management that automate the traceability reports and the impact analysis when one requirement changes and what effects on the tests does it have. Like, all that burdensome manual work is what, in my 35 years of experience, that's why we hate the documentation, because it's very painful. But that doesn't need to be the case anymore. Tools like Matrix requirements and others really help facilitate the documentation throughout the process, in an iterative fashion versus just snow plowing it to the end, and you have this X man month effort to tighten up the documentation and reverse engineer what it was you actually built. So those are the 4 key takeaways that we hope you got out of this webinar. And I think there's time for questions, if I recall correctly.
Yes, hi, Robin. We do have a number of questions coming in. So I do want to let people know, if we don't get to your question today, we will follow up and show, so we will get your response. But one of the questions was going to this idea of bridging the gap of what are the key challenges that you face when you're looking at the Agile and DevOps and the regulatory teams. What are the challenges they face when trying to bridge the gap between the two groups, and how do you mitigate those challenges?
I can take a first pass. From my perspective, it's the definition of done. So a software developer has his definition that, oh, I finished my code, I checked it in, and I'm done. A tester has their definition of, hey, well, I've tested it. But that common definition of done across the whole team really helps bridge that. And I've been in a lot of teams where sprint 1 was, development, and then in sprint 2, the developers were working on new features, but the testers were testing sprint 1. And then sprint 3, the documenters were documenting what was done in 1 and 2. And so that true definition of done, where developers have moved on in that model. You need a common definition of done so that this done is done. And that includes every stakeholder, including the regulatory submission, including the business, to see what was developed and be able to feedback. So I think that's how you bridge that. It's not a bridge, it's a island. You're all on the same island.
Great. And we had a question, what is the difference between DevOps and Agile?
Well,
Go ahead, Latanya.
okay. So DevOps and Agile, actually, when it comes to quality and development, you have a lot of things that kind of go along. Agile is a methodology. It's like a way of thinking. It's not a cooking recipe. In a way, you can link them by saying DevOps are good practices as well when it comes to development. And you can also add SRE, which is side of which now became System Reliability Engineering, was developed as well by Google Cloud when we want to have a good system, a good software, and to make sure that we do not have a lot of bugs. So all of this, you can kind of align them. You can also add in the family of DevOps, MLOps, which is DevOps for machine learning. When it comes to the best practices, you can add some security dimension to it. So they are kind of different fields, but the different faces of the same coin. If we can have a coin with multiple faces.
Great.
And just to tie it to what I said is that the definition of done, I mean, the DevOps role was a huge accelerator in the overall, to mitigate the developer idea. Well, I checked in my code, I'm done. I know I worked, I compiled it. But to actually get it into a working environment with the automation that a DevOps team and continuous pipeline provides, as I mentioned, people instrumenting their CI/CD pipelines with that documentation output, so that the documentation is actually created as well as the executable code within these environments. I just feel like it's another role that is key to that definition of done. It's not done till it's on an environment where somebody can actually use it. Yeah.
And we have a question that's a little bit of a follow-up, but the attendee said initially our SW or software developers were confused by keeping the compliance and documentation requirements compared to the flexibility and quick movement of Agile. So how do you respond or propose a solution that benefits the developers, the business, and your quality and regulatory professionals? And I guess part of that is compliance probably doesn't fit with a group that wants to move quickly and agilely.
Well, I think it's a coexistence within a tool set that allows you to coexist, which allows, getting credit for agile practices that are often non-compliant, meaning, you just go to a Jira card and you update it and you write it and you go like, oh, I've written a requirement. We have to allow that to happen, but we also need to get credit for it and bring it into a sense of control. So with these modern tools that allow us to take snapshots of the Jira dashboards and the Jira Scrum boards, and maybe the final Scrum meeting before the end of the cycle is more of a design review function. It's not just a daily stand-up, what'd you do, what blah, blah, blah. It's actually creating a design review approval of that incremental small set of requirements that allows that little slice of pie delivered during that cycle to still be compliant, yet was, you know, logistically implemented with a very agile methodology. I mean, Jira cards are, everybody, you know, uses that tool, but to have that as a repository, that's our regulatory documentation. That's where the flaw is. Like, what are you going to do? Give your Jira credentials to the FDA guy and said it's all in there. Go figure it out. No, there has to be a cutting edge tool that allows you to allow that type of agility to happen in a best in class tool, but get credit for it in a somewhat more controlled tool with the infrastructure regulations, you know, the audit trail of that change, the locking of that, the rolling of it into an approved document that's signed, that's in a design history file. Like, those regulatory needs, you know, can be met incrementally via the integration of these types of best in class tools.
And we have a couple of questions that are related to AI. So Bethany, I'll direct those to you. The first one was, you talked about data quality and bias. How do you determine which data is good data?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I lagged for a second.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, it lagged for me for a second. Could you please repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. They were asking, when it comes to your AI algorithms, you had mentioned, you know, concerns with bias and data quality. How do you know which data is good data in terms of building your algorithm?
Okay, so this question is, I believe, extremely relevant, especially with the AI Act coming, where we have to prove what we're doing is a right thing, although we don't have any clear specification yet, but we can sense it. And the basis of artificial intelligence is our data set. With what are we going to train our model? So we cannot just get any data set we found on the internet and Google, like, yeah, a breast cancer data set, for instance, and start working with it. There's, before going to that part, there's a whole work called of data mining. And when you do your data mining, your job is to dive into this data and to try to find, you find the patterns. If you have missing values, if you have incorrect values, for instance, we have a missing value, what should we do? Should we just erase the row and ignore it, or should we try to replace the missing value using the mean, if it's like numbers, depending on others? So there's actually a lot of tools that we can use to help us doing that, but there's no other options, unfortunately, than diving into it. It's like people who want to do deep learning, so using neural networks. So we have to use a certain number of neurons. But can I give you a number, like telling you, yeah, you need 5, and this is going to be the most perfect number? Unfortunately, no. You have to go and test and see what is the most efficient thing, and to be extremely careful with your data.
And there's a sort of a, not follow-up, but AI related. The attender is asking, how do Agile practices support the development of AI algorithms for medical devices? Does that process offer certain benefits over what others?
Yeah, actually, we can say that AI development is still software development. Regardless of what we're trying to build, we're still doing a software. So the logic would still be the same. And this is why earlier we mentioned that agility is a methodology. It's a logic. So you can imagine you want to build some software as a medical device, which has an AI component. So you can divide your sprints with what you want to do. For instance, you could have your first sprint is understanding your data set, finding it, understanding it, doing the work in it, doing the whole reporting regarding it, because you have to prove where you got your data from, how accurate was it, if you did your testing on your data, if you did some data visualization. Then you validate it, it has been reviewed and approved, you can move on to the next. And as you go, you report, you document, and you move on to the next step. Then you can start working on building your model. As we said, we try to optimize it, make sure we don't have what we call overfitting or underfitting. So we want to make sure our accuracy is the best. And we can continue as we go like this.
And we have time for one more question. This one has to do with documentation. So in an Agile compliant environment, what role does documentation play, and how can companies strike a balance between maintaining the necessary records but avoiding excessive bureaucracy? And Rob, I'll start with you if that's.
I'm sorry, you cut out as well. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, in an Agile compliant environment, what role does documentation play, and how can companies strike a balance between maintaining necessary records and avoiding excessive bureaucracy?
Yeah, again, back to that, incrementally create that documentation as part of the work. I think that's the way to strike the balance, because you define the definition of done that includes that documentation. The level of depth of the documentation is also highly dependent upon the risk classification of the device, and that's why that safety classification document and the project plan from the very beginning defines that level of output. Typically, always user type requirements and system type validation is necessary, but on a non-medical device or a class A, the architecture documentation is very simple. It's just a architecture chart, if you will, a roadmap to where it is. But the detailed documentation required, the detailed unit testing, 62304 describes all the details that, it's key upon that initial risk assessment, and both from a safety classification perspective, and then risk analysis activities of the device itself, the software that you're doing. I mean, that should be, and I'm glad that number was so high in our poll. That should really drive the documentation level, because it's not about the documentation, it's about the safety and the efficacy of the software, right? And you have to use, I believe you have to use 14971 as a tool, not for documentation, but for reliability and failure analysis. Most people, myself included, as a developer in my career early, I thought happy path only. You just know how the software's supposed to work, but you don't think about how it's not going to work on both user errors, which again surprised me that our usability tests number was so low on that poll. You have to account for people that are going to make mistakes. And so for running through those risk management activities, like failure modes, effects analysis on software, software faults, looking at components that can fail that you don't even know where they came from. Google wrote it. Well, what are all the things that can go wrong with it? Think like a user and an old person that has early Alzheimer's onset. Like, how are they going to mess up your app, right? So you have to take those things into account and focus on those aspects to, I think, drive where that balance is in the documentation.
Great, thank you so much. And actually, it's interesting, one of our attendees did point out on the standards poll that they could only choose one. So they wanted to let you know they have more than one standard. They do have the usability. So I think there's more out to that.
That's good.
Yeah. But Rob and Luthana, thank you so much for being here and for the presentation and for answering all of our questions. We so appreciate your time. And I want to thank all of the attendees also for being here today, and just remind you, if you go to medtechintelligence.com, you can see a list of our upcoming webinars and in-person events, and we certainly hope you will join us again, and we wish you all a great rest of your day.
Great. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.